So hello everybody, I'm going to get started. My name is Jen Kelley, and today I'm going to be telling you a concrete definition of how to go from a junior developer to a mid-level developer. I'm currently in Chicago. I work for cking, which is a great company, and we're hiring. So if you're looking for a job, come talk to me afterwards. You get these sweet socks and a great work environment. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I tweet about knitting a lot, so beware. I'm going to tell you a little bit about past Jen. I originally wanted to be a meteorologist when I went to college. The reasons aren't important. The point is, I did not become a meteorologist. I have a degree, couldn't find a job, worked a bunch of terrible Starbucksy retail jobs until I worked with lawyers and they yelled at me, and I was like, you know what? I should probably be an adult and figure out what I want to do with the rest of my life. So at that point, I decided I want to be a developer. At this time, I had never used a MacBook Pro and I had an Android phone, so naturally I decided to become an iOS developer. So I went to Mobile Makers in Chicago. It's an iOS dev boot camp. No longer exists, sadly, but it was great. And I've been working in the field for 3 years now. I've worked on a couple different teams, and I was very, very good at being a junior developer because I didn't know anything about computers. I didn't know how code worked. I didn't understand what a server was, what is a bit or a byte. It was all foreign to me. And then a couple years into my career, I was like, well, am I at that next level? One of the things is I was so worried about all of the knowledge that there existed is I wasn't sure when I could qualify myself as a mid-level developer. And so I asked the internet, what is a mid-level developer? And everything is very vague. It's very impossible to know what level you're at because there's not, in general, a good definition. So I put it upon myself to figure out sort of 12 things that you should know to consider yourself a mid-level developer. But before I tell you all of these secrets, I just wanted to get sort of a read of the room. Is there anyone here who would consider themselves a junior developer or are not really sure if they are a junior developer? Cool, some people. Is there anyone here who's more experienced and has mentored juniors or wants to mentor juniors? Cool. Yay, everybody. So these are two sort of groups that I'm targeting. When you're mentoring, sometimes it's hard to know what to teach because you know a lot, and it's hard to distill that knowledge. And if you're a junior, it's hard to know what to study because there's a lot of knowledge. I've broken this up into 4 sort of main points. And this first one is everything, or things that everyone says you should do, but they don't really tell you why you should do it. In a couple slides, I'm going to show you some of my very first code from one of my first projects. It's brilliant. And this will be highlighted. The point with naming is that you may think that you know what you named something, but in the future, you're not going to remember what it does. When I was starting out, I liked to name things really clever names because I thought it was funny. But then when I would go back and read that code, I would have no idea what it was doing. Naming is super important if you're working on a team as well because other people need to be able to read your code. You're all working on one code base. If someone can't grok what you're trying to do, that's a problem. Another thing sort of involved with naming is breaking things into smaller pieces. When you first start out, well, I'm speaking personally, but I'm sure other people have the same experience. Everyone hears about MVC, Massive View Controller. And of course you do it because you don't really know how code works and it's all in one file and you know where it is. I personally had lots of local variables, mutable of course, and it wasn't until I learned more about how computers work that I understood why this was bad. But this in specific works because when you're growing a project, you don't want to put everything in one file. It's going to be impossible to go back and find variables you need to change or reuse things. If you use network code in your view controller, if you want to build another view controller, you're just going to have to copy and paste that. The main thing with all of my points is initially you can get away with this, but if you want to grow as a developer, if you want to have a project for more than a day, you're going to need to work on it, and these are things that you can do for future self that future self will appreciate. So this is my old code, beautiful. It's Objective-C, so I apologize if you're not familiar with it. But does anybody have any sort of idea, just from looking at it, what it does? and you can sort of get a feel, maybe it's setting things up. After looking at this for 5 minutes, it sets up the view, and then it sets up initial variables. One way that I can make this much easier to refactor and make it look way nicer is split those two parts up into their own function, and then if I ever needed to change initial scores, I would know exactly where to look and not have to deal with all of this stuff. I would also like to point out self.which player equals yes. That doesn't make any sense. And you can see that in this next example where if self.which player equals yes is true, then something happens. It took me a little bit to figure out that this is player one. This brings me to another problem with my code. It is very tightly coupled. So if I ever wanted to add more than 2 players, it would be impossible to do with this scheme. I would have to change a Boolean to an enum maybe. If I wanted to change the scoring of this logic, it would be impossible to do because it's all coupled together. This was something I had a lot of trouble with in the beginning because I was like, well, all code is coupled. It's like the same thing. One thing that sort of broke it out for me so I could understand it is if you need to change something, do you have to change it in a lot of places? If something is all over your code base and you need to change it, it's going to be a huge pain to change it, and you're probably going to mess up because everybody makes mistakes. So decoupling in the future saves you time, and it leads to cleaner code. Tests. Everybody says you should write tests. Every single person. But when I was starting out, I was like, okay, I have to write 2 times the amount of code, and I can just like write code once and test it, and I know it works. Why would I ever write a test? The thing with tests is you don't know what you're going to break in the future. So if you don't have a part of your app under test, and you go back and in 6 months, you need to change your networking stack. If you don't know what it touches, which you probably won't because apps grow exponentially, you will have no idea if you broke something. It's also very hard to keep track of sort of one-off weird things that your app does. So if a product manager wants A, B, C, sometimes D, but only in these conditions, if you're touching that feature in the future, it's going to be very hard for you to remember the sometimes D, and this will help prevent future mistakes. My next section is general computer things. This is just sort of what you should do in general to be a good developer. You should know about source control, and you should use source control. If you're on a team, you basically have to use source control, because if you both touch the same file, there's going to be conflicts. You have to figure out which code to put in which place. You might think if you're a solo developer that you don't need source control because I'm going to touch my own code. I know what I'm doing all the time, but you never know what you're doing all the time. Let's say that you release a new feature and it completely crashes your app. Instead of then having to frantically try to figure out what you did wrong, if you were using source control, you'd be able to go back to the last stable build and release that, therefore saving you all the negative reviews and a lot of pain for yourself. And I would also like to call out with source control, you do not need to be like a terminal mastermind. It's perfectly acceptable to use a GUI or an interface for Git. Especially, I found on larger teams, it's really hard to visualize like all the branches and how everything interacts. So I use a GUI, so it's fine. Even if you think you're going to build an app with all local storage, at some point in your career, you're going to have to interact with the network. And having to interact with the network, if you've never done it, can be a little daunting because there is a ton of terminology around it. One big thing you should know is just sort of general terminology around networks. Do you know what a request is or a response? Do you know get, put, post, delete? If you're getting back a 500, is that your fault or someone else's fault? Could be both. The big thing to take away here is there's a lot of stuff to learn with servers and networks, but you just need to know the basics to be able to communicate with people. One of the common things that I ran into is, as a junior developer, I didn't really know how to talk about code or how to discuss problems I was seeing. So having a shared vocabulary is sort of one of the main things you can do to level up. Immutability and mutability. Why is it bad to have a mutable variable just hanging around? So let's say you have a giant container of cookies and it's just in the middle of the room and anybody can access it. You never have any idea what's actually in that container. You don't know how many people have accessed it, what it's going to be at any time. If you were trying to debug something with that cookie container, it would be impossible to do. If something's immutable, you have it in one space. Maybe only you know where it is, or maybe you and a friend know where it is. But the point is you have more control over everything. And being a developer is a lot about control. You can't control everything, but the things you can control, you should try to control them. I just said control a lot. But we are at an iOS conference, so what specifically should you know with iOS? This talk is sort of general, so this section could be applied to other, like if you're an Android developer or a Java developer, you should know your platform and common pitfalls. So with iOS development, Xcode, or where you code, is a super important thing to know. There's a lot of really cool things you can do with it. There's a lot of shortcut keys. Command-Shift-O is my most used because I never know where I am in my code base, and I sort of remember what I named that class, but I never remember what I named that class. iOS, the view lifecycle is a little difficult to grok, and views in general are sort of difficult. One thing I feel like makes them difficult is the responder chain, so you should have sort of a vague understanding of how that works and how to communicate between view controllers, views, other assorted things. Common design elements. You're going to have to write a table view. You should know what a data source is. You should know how delegates work. Basic design things that Apple gives you, you should know how to use. It's also very important to realize that the code you're going to write is probably not as good as someone else's code. And sometimes it makes more sense for you to use a third-party library, because you could spend 3 months writing the perfect framework for something, but that's 3 months that you could have saved doing something actually useful for your app. It is important to understand that when you're adding a dependency, that is a point of control that you no longer have. So it's very important to sort of grok if it's a good repository or a bad repository. There's a couple things you can look for with this, how many stars it has, if it's constantly maintained, if when people bring up issues, they're resolved, when the last time it was updated. And also, I think it's really important to pay attention to when they sort of update their Swift version and iOS version, because it's constantly changing. You need to be on top of those things. Another thing with third-party dependencies is it's very big with decoupling. If you have a dependency all over your app and you need to rip that dependency out, it's going to be a pain in the butt. So please decouple your third-party dependency from the rest of your code base. And my next section is sort of things that I've learned along the way that really helped me sort of level up as an engineer. Reading classic computer science books was a way for me to understand the magic behind what I was doing. When I first started out, I was like, what? I write words, and then a computer does something, and then I have an app. That's magical. I think a lot of the concepts I talked about, you really have to understand sort of what a bit is, what memory is, what readable and writable mean. And reading classic computer science books is really helpful for a number of reasons. The first reason is that it explains things generally in an easy to understand way. If they've been around a long time and people are talking about them, they've generally been very helpful to a lot of people. It's also really helpful because generally they're written in an older language, so maybe you've only written in Swift and you don't know any Java. As you develop in your career, you're going to have to learn about other concepts in other languages. So for example, working effectively with legacy code, I think was written in Java, and I had no idea what an interface was, because with app development in Swift, it's like, well, you put it in a file and there's classes and enums. But being able to have sort of vocabulary around what things are. Design Patterns is a super difficult book to read, but it'll give you a lot of information. When you want to level up your code design, if you want to write good code, you're going to need to reuse things, and people have been doing the same things with computers for many years. So you're not going to create anything new. It's probably been around, and this gives you, like I said, a common vernacular to describe it with other developers that you're talking to, etc. You all came to a conference, so you did this one. Good job, everybody. As you're developing, it's going to be, you're going to come across questions that you don't know and things you don't understand. And it's very important that you have sort of a support network to bounce things off of, and it also allows you to know whether or not you know what you're talking about. Sometimes people have a lot of self-doubt, sometimes they have a lot of confidence, but sort of getting a baseline with other people is always important. This also brings up a point that I implicitly talked about my entire talk, but communication is a huge factor in being a mid-level developer. You have to be able to answer why you're doing something. You have to be able to communicate with other people. When I first wanted to be a developer, I was like, great, I'm just going to be behind a computer and listen to music and not talk to anyone. But that was the opposite. I talk to people all day now. I have to talk to product. I have to talk to back-end people. I have to talk to people on my team. If you don't know what you're talking about or you can't communicate it, you can't get ahead, and you probably can't get anything done. My biggest point, if you take nothing else away from this talk, is ask questions. Everybody starts out knowing nothing, and asking questions lets you learn things. One thing I've found is that a lot of more experienced people use a lot of slang and abbreviations, and if you're not familiar with it, you have no idea what they're talking about. Another sort of thing is a bad word. Another theory I live my life by is that if someone can't explain something, even if they're more experienced, they probably don't understand what they're doing, and that's sort of a red flag for me. If you ask someone who knows everything a question and they can't explain it, they don't understand it, and that's not good. Which brings me to the ultimate conclusion. The biggest difference between a junior and a mid-level dev is the ability to understand the why in addition to the how. You are going to write code and you think it makes perfect sense, but someone might say, well, why not do it this way? And you have to be able to give concrete reasons why this code works better or is more performant or is easier to understand. When you start out, there's a lot of talk about, well, we want to write good code, but good code is very nebulous. So asking why, being able to explain things, these are concrete things that you can do in order to level up your career or level up someone else's career by telling them to do this. This dog is ramping up. But just to recap some of the things that I went over, break things into small components, write good names, don't couple things, know immutability and mutability, networks, source control, don't rewrite the wheel, know your platform, tests, computer science, meetups, questions. A lot of stuff. Basically, if you take nothing else away, ask questions, start to learn the reasons why you do things. I took my definitions off the internet, so these are my sources. Does anybody have any questions?
Can you think of anything that you didn't realize you didn't know until you were further in the process that might be a good thing to make sure junior developers know about?
There is so much. I think the most important thing is just that I think coupling code and decoupling code and just that concept is super important. And I think a lot, it's very easy with using examples like, oh, the cookie jar, immutable, mutable. But to make sure someone actually understands through code examples, like what a coupled segment of code looks like versus a decoupled and why, I think that's probably the most important thing.
So as a junior developer, I'm assuming you were able to get away with stuff. Did that end when you became
I mean, get away with this, sort of. I think the thing, I struggled a lot with self-doubt when I was starting out, and I think one of the more important things as a junior developer is that you might think you're getting away with something, but you might know more than someone else. So I guess just always question, and everybody makes mistakes all the time. It doesn't matter what level you're at, so you'll probably get away with the same stuff.
For those of us who haven't, like, we don't have comp sci degrees, you know, I think that a lot of us deal with, like, feeling like frauds occasionally.
Yeah.
Do you have any other resources, or, like, is it necessary? Do we need to be feeling that way, or is that because, like, we were missing something, like gaps in our knowledge, or did it just teach a lot of theory that we're not going to use anyway?
It's a good question. I think initially, especially you start out, you're like, oh, well, you don't need a computer science degree to be a programmer. That's true, but I think if you want to progress, you do have to understand some basic concepts. That being said, I don't think they teach. I think they teach a lot of bullshit in computer science degrees. You can figure out some of the basics of computer science that you need to know just by reading programming books, talking to other developers. If you want to do really intense stuff, you probably need to know more computer science, but like we're building apps. It's not that hard.
To your question there, if you're not familiar with the term imposter syndrome, look it up, and there are lots of talks out there. I have a friend who does talks on imposter syndrome. It's something I'm still a junior myself, fighting for the mid-level myself, right, where she was, and it's something I suffer with every day. You just feel like a fraud, and I did get a degree, and I still feel like a fraud.
Okay.
So if that helps you feel better.
Okay, well, yeah, it actually does. Thank you.
Same here.
Okay.
Yeah, I think one thing also to realize is that everybody feels like a fraud. And if you don't feel like a fraud, you probably should feel like a fraud. Anything else? So this was my very first conference talk. Yay! On the app, there's a section for feedback, so if you wouldn't mind giving me just any feedback, that would be wonderful. But thank you so much.
Volunteer.